right, church. Today is September 9th, and it is a very special day because this is the feast day of St. Peter Claver, the patron saint of St. Peter Claver Parish in PG, which is the oldest Jesuit parish in the country. We were born in 1862. And today's gospel is a perfect gospel reading for Peter Claver's feast because it talks about the poor and the hungry and the rich. All right, so this reading is from St. Luke, the Gospel of St. Luke. Raising his eyes toward his disciples, Jesus said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom of God is yours. Blessed are you who are now hungry, you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who are now weeping, you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude and insult you, and denounce your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice and leap for joy on that day. Behold, your reward will be great in heaven. For their ancestors treated the prophets in the same way. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are filled now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, you will grieve and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for their ancestors treated the false prophets in the same way." The Gospel of the Lord. Okay, church, we're talking about the 16th century, 1500s to 1600s. Cartagena in Colombia was a major port, and every year 10,000 slaves, newly captured from Africa, arrived in Colombia. And of that 10,000 that lived, approximately 20,000 African bodies were thrown overboard because they were killed. Now, so 1500s, 1600s, when the slave ship came in, people had to go out to them, and some people had to go down into the holds where the slaves were all tied. Okay. The smell of those holds, of those cargo holds, with their human cargo and their feces and their filth, it smelled horrible. It was an unbearable stench in those holds. And people that had been working with slaves for years never ever grew accustomed to the filth and the stench of those cargo holds carrying those slaves. But Peter Claver would go out to meet every ship, and he would be one of the first ones down into the cargo hold to begin to minister to these traumatized Africans. And Peter Claver himself said, well, if what you need to be a saint is a strong stomach, then maybe I'm a saint. Okay, there is no describing the stench, the horrible stench. And that stench was only the beginning of his ministering to these slaves. He had to overcome language difficulties, cultural difficulties. He had to help with the sickness. And then he had to see those slaves get taken away to their slave plantations. And maybe he would never see them again. And for him, that was heartbreaking. Okay, now, Peter Claver did manage to make it to some of the plantations, and he would minister to the slaves. But the owners of the slaves did not appreciate his presence. They said that his presence gave spirit or hope to the slave. And the slave master had been trying to beat the hope out of the slave, to beat the energy and the vigor out of the slave. They wanted him to be like animals, like like oxen and horses, to be told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and just to be led. And so Peter Claver was not popular with the slave owners. Okay. And the people of Cartagena said, you're wasting your time. And all you're doing is upsetting the slaves and the slave owners. Never, not ever in his life, did he have a day working with the slaves where he thought, we're making progress. Peter Claver, in his life, never made any progress. Slavery was abounding in the Caribbean. Slavery was abounding in the Americas. Slavery was abounding in Europe. And this was really the beginning of it. Peter Claver was overwhelmed by the cultural, sociological, and financial difficulty of the slave trade. All he could do was comfort a few slaves, console a few slaves, baptize the slaves, but catechism was almost impossible. Okay, now, here we come to our gospel. Who do you think the slave owners were? You couldn't be a poor person and own a slave. The people that owned slaves were the wealthy. They owned the slaves, and they were willing to go to war to keep their slaves. The Pope had denounced slavery. But Catholics, Christians, nobody listened to what the Pope had to say. There was too much money, too much dependence on the slave trade. And so what did Peter Claver do? He just worked every day. And he worked his fingers to the bone, fighting this gross injustice. And in his entire life, there would never be a day when he could say, it looks like the slave trade is going to be over. Never. Never. And so, he was a true hero. He was a true hero because he fought against something that overwhelmed him. And despite it overwhelming him, he did not give up. He fought every day of his priestly life against an injustice that he had no hope to overcome. It would be endless. It would be endless. And who was it that fought against him? It was the rich. It was the wealthy. It was investors. It was the socially, the economically upper crust. And this is what Jesus is talking about. Woe to you who weep. Well, he's talking to St. Peter Claver. Woe to you who are rich. He's talking to the slave owners. All right. So, in his 70th year, Peter Claver finally died. And guess who? Guess who was the greatest celebrators of his life? He was so famous by the time he died that all these rich people that hated him, they're the ones who wanted to throw the funeral. They're the ones who wanted to celebrate the Mass. They're the ones who wanted their reputation associated with this man who, while he was alive, they insulted and denigrated. So there were two funeral masses, church. The rich and the wealthy had this audacious, magnificent funeral. And then guess who else had a funeral? The African slaves. They had their own funeral for this man who was one of the most heroic saints I have ever come across. I am very proud to be the pastor of a church named after St. Peter Claver. When it comes to heroism, you are going to have to go a long way before you find a greater hero than St. Peter Claver. And so, church, Today, we celebrate the feast of St. Peter Claver, a great man, an indomitable man, a man who fought for justice, but who would not see it in his day. So, thank God for the witness of St. Peter Claver.